Thunder rumbled across the Roman sky like the wrath of Jupiter himself, shaking the marble pillars of the greatest empire on earth. But even the storm's fury could not silence the screams that tore through the emperor's private chambers that night. Deep within the imperial palace, where golden ceilings reflected torchlight like liquid fire, the echoes were not of battle nor of celebration, but of something far more terrifying. Senator Lucius Marcus stood frozen, his torch trembling in his hand, the flame shivering as though it too feared what lay beyond the heavy oaken doors. His breath hitched, his knees nearly gave way, but the guards beside him spoke with cold precision. "Hold it steady, Senator. The Emperor demands light." And so the torch stayed high, not to illuminate glory, but to witness horror. Beyond those doors, no feast awaited, no council of war, no law being written. Only the defilement of innocence masquerading as royal right. A girl, barely 14, was stripped not only of her garments, but of her very existence as a human being. In that moment, she became nothing more than a figure in a record, another faceless offering to a monstrous appetite hidden behind silk curtains and imperial symbols. Men who once commanded legions, defended laws, and spoke of Roman honor now stood as silent witnesses, torchbearers to their own civilization's decay. Rome, the empire that had crushed kings and conquered nations, had turned its violence inward, consuming its daughters, its morality, its soul. This was no whispered myth, no poet's exaggeration. It was the grim reality of history, the legacy of Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, the man the world remembers by a far darker name, Caligula, the mad emperor. When news of Emperor Tiberius's death swept through Rome in March of 37 CE, the city exhaled as though awakening from a long nightmare. For 23 years, the people had lived beneath the shadow of his paranoia, where a careless whisper could lead to execution, and trust itself had become treason. The Senate tiptoed through fear, the citizens forgot laughter, and even the Praetorian Guard waited for someone, to break the silence. That someone appeared in the form of a young man whose name carried divine weight. Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, known affectionately as Caligula, Little Boots, a nickname born from childhood days spent in miniature armor, marching beside his father, the heroic general Germanicus. To the people, Caligula was not merely another emperor. He was the promise of rebirth, the blood of Augustus, the son of a beloved general, the boy who had walked among soldiers rather than slaves. When he ascended the throne, Rome erupted with euphoria. Trumpets blared across the forum, banners flew high, and the citizens cheered with tears in their eyes, believing at last that hope had returned. And for a brief, glittering moment, Caligula seemed every bit the savior they dreamed of. Charming, generous, merciful, the Senate praised him as a god reborn, but no one could have imagined how swiftly that god would turn into a monster. When Caligula first entered the capital, he did so not as a tyrant cloaked in suspicion, but as a golden son of Rome, smiling, radiant, and eager to be adored. Gone was the cold stillness that had haunted the empire under Tiberius. In its place came laughter, generosity, and the intoxicating charm of youth. He opened the imperial treasury, granting lavish bonuses to the legions, forgiving taxes that had crushed the poor, and hosting grand spectacles that painted the Colosseum red with glory and blood. For the first time in years, the people cheered their emperor without fear. The Senate, long cowed into silence, now dared to hope again. They whispered to one another that this young ruler might be the perfect balance of Julius Caesar's charisma and Augustus's wisdom. Even the most hardened senators wiped tears from their eyes when Caligula entered the Curia, a living symbol of Rome reborn. Temples filled with sacrifices of gratitude, altars smoked with incense, and in the bustling marketplaces, citizens spoke of him as the dawn after a long, endless night. At last, they said, Rome had found a leader who smiled, who felt, who seemed human, but beneath that marble mask of youth, something unseen was stirring. Threads of darkness slowly weaving themselves through the bright tapestry of his reign. At first, it was invisible, like a hairline crack across a perfect statue. The first to vanish was a serving girl from the palace kitchens. The steward claimed she had run away, terrified of punishment. Yet days later, her body surfaced in the Tiber, mutilated in ways even hardened soldiers refused to describe. Two more disappeared soon after, a 15-year-old boy and a 17-year-old girl. Their corpses were found downstream, their faces twisted in a frozen scream. The palace said nothing. The emperor smiled as though nothing had happened. And Rome, intoxicated by its newfound joy, chose silence over truth. "He is young," they whispered. "His pleasures will fade with time. Power makes all men reckless." Those were the lies they told themselves to smother the growing pulse of dread in their chests. Then, in October of 37 CE, barely 6 months into his reign, the gods cast their dice. Caligula fell ill. A mysterious fever gripped him, twisting his body between life and death. The empire held its breath. Priests sacrificed oxen, wine flowed across temple altars, and even battle-hardened soldiers, who had mocked the gods, found themselves whispering desperate prayers to Mars and Jupiter for their emperor's recovery. Weeks passed in terror until at last Caligula rose from his bed, pale, trembling, but alive. Rome erupted in wild celebration. Bells rang from temples, banquets filled the night, and the Senate declared his survival a divine miracle. But those who had seen him up close swore in hushed voices that the man who awoke was not the same man who had fallen ill. Something in his eyes had changed. A strange light that flickered like madness beneath the surface. The fever had burned something human out of him and left behind a being who no longer believed he was mortal. Caligula was convinced that he had faced death and conquered it. He returned not as emperor, but as a living god. From that moment onward, the laws of men no longer applied. His desires were divine commands, his pleasures, sacred decrees. What began as subtle indulgence soon blossomed into ritualized corruption. Grand banquets became theaters of humiliation. The wives of senators received private invitations to dine with the emperor. Invitations no husband dared question, and no woman could refuse. Young boys from noble families were summoned to serve in the palace, honored with titles that masked their real purpose. They were dressed in silk, their faces painted with rouge, turned into playthings of imperial amusement. Still, the Senate pretended not to see. "He is young," they said again. "He will learn restraint." But indulgence did not fade. It calcified into cruelty. By 38 CE, the transformation was complete. The palace guard was purged of honorable men, replaced by soldiers chosen not for bravery, but for brutality. Their loyalty was secured not through oaths, but through shared depravity. Caligula appointed a freedman named Helen as master of pleasures, a man whose sole duty was to fulfill every desire of the emperor, no matter how obscene. Soon, the imperial archives began to change. The scrolls once filled with records of trade and taxation now held something far more disturbing. Inventories of flesh, lists written in meticulous Latin, cataloguing not shipments of grain or gold, but human lives. Women and children, daughters of senators, wives of noblemen, sons of merchants, all reduced to numbers, each name crossed out and replaced with a tally mark. Rome, the empire that had prided itself on law, honor, and civilization, was rotting from within. The palace had become a temple of desecration, and the emperor its god of perversion. What had once been whispered as rumor was now written in ink, recorded by scribes who sat in candlelit alcoves, turning human agony into paperwork. The machine of the empire had turned inward, no longer conquering lands, but consuming its own people. What began as a few hidden crimes had now become state policy. The torches that once lit Rome's glory now illuminated its shame, as the city that ruled the world descended into the madness of one man who believed himself divine. By his second year on the throne, Caligula was no longer the golden hope of Rome, but the shadow that haunted it. The emperor who once smiled like a savior now ruled like a god of cruelty. He demanded temples built in his honor, statues carved beside Jupiter himself, and priests ordered to pray not for him, but to him. Senators, once proud and powerful, now knelt and kissed his feet, terrified of meeting the fate that awaited those who displeased him. The palace that had once symbolized Rome's strength became a house of nightmares. Nights turned into endless feasts where wine flowed, music roared, and screams hid behind laughter. Noble women and young boys from Rome's finest families were summoned under the pretense of honor, only to vanish into the emperor's chambers. Helen, his so-called master of pleasures, ensured that every monstrous desire was fulfilled, no matter how inhuman. In the imperial archives, a new kind of record began to appear, not of victories or taxes, but of people. Each name was reduced to a number, each life catalogued with the same cold precision once used for counting gold. daughters of senators, wives of equestrians, sons of merchants, all listed like property in a growing inventory of pain. Yet outside the palace walls, Rome pretended all was well. The markets stayed busy, the temples glowed with incense, and the people whispered their fears only in shadows. But they all knew. The emperor had gone mad. The man who called himself divine had turned Rome's glory into its own cage. And beneath every torchlight of the palace, the empire's soul burned a little darker.